Hello all, welcome to the video Introduction to Tables from SQL Server eTraining.com. This is Satish. So as part of today's agenda, we will see how to create a table using a tool and t-sql, and the command how to insert the data into a table, and then at the end of the video we will see how do we retrieve the data from the table. So let's get started. So first we will see how to create a table definition. So go to Management Studio, and then I have a database called SQL Server eTraining, and then all the t-sql I'll be writing against this particular database. So first you want to make sure which database you want to work on. So whichever database you want to work on, just select that particular database from the drop down list, and then let's see how do we create a table. So if you click on SQL Server eTraining, the database, and then if you click under tables, you don't see any tables, the user defined tables which are already created. So if you right click on the tables and then click new table, here you can provide the columns which you want to have. Let's say customer ID, and then the data type is integer, and then allow nulls or not nulls. We will see what are nulls and what are not nulls. And then customer first name, let's say varchar 50, and then customer last name, varchar 50, and let's say date of birth, date time field. Alright, so I have all my columns, 4 columns, and then once you have these columns, just right click on that particular tab and then save table 1, and then here you can provide the table name. Let's say customer, and then click OK. So once that's done, your table will be created. So if you click on tables and then refresh, you can see the customer table got created. Alright, so that's how you create a table using the tool. Now let's see how do we create a table using t-sql code. So the syntax for creating a table is create table and then the table name, open bracket, and column 1, column data type, and then let's say null or not null. Alright, so you have to provide all this information for different columns. Okay, so you may create any number of columns in a table. So that's your table syntax. Alright, so let's try to create a table. So create table, and let's say table name as customer using SQL. Alright, that's my table name, and then I want to provide the column names. So customer ID, and then the data type is integer, and then let's say I'm allowing nulls for now, and then my second column is customer first name, and then varchar 50, and then customer last name as varchar 50, and then the date of birth as date time field, the first name and last name also null fields, and then the date of birth as null. Alright, so that's my simple syntax for creating a table. So once I have that query ready, make sure you are in the correct database context and then click execute. So once you click execute, it says the command completed successfully, and then if you refresh your tables, you can see the customer underscore SQL table got created. So if you click on that customer underscore SQL, you can see columns, and then if you expand columns, you can see all the column names and then the data types and then the null properties of each column. Alright, so that's how your table can be created using t-sql code. And then if you want to view these column or column properties, you can expand the columns under that particular table and then you can view those properties. Alright, so now we know that how do we create a table using t-sql code. Let's see how do we insert data into this particular table. So we have to use a DML command called insert. So when we try to create the table definition or the table structure, we have used a command called create, which is a DDL command. That is a data definition language command. That means you are trying to create a table structure. For that reason, you have to use DDL command. Now, if you want to insert data, that means you are working with the data. So for that reason, you have to use a DML command called data manipulation language, and the command you want to use is insert. So the syntax for insert into table name and then list of columns, column 1, column 2, all the columns you want to insert data into. Alright, and then the values you want to provide to insert into those columns. Alright, so let's try to insert some data into the table. Let's say we will be inserting some data into customer SQL. So provide the column names, the customer ID, and then the customer first name, customer last name, and then date of birth. It's always good to copy the column names from the Object Explorer so that you may not do some typo errors. Okay, because if you do some typo errors, it will throw you an error. So it's always good to copy paste the column names or whatever names, the object names, the table names. Alright, you can also drag and drop. Alright, so just drag and drop and then you can get those column names. So once you have listed the column names, you want to provide the values. So customer ID, it's an integer value. So let's say just provide 101, and then the customer first name, the strings and characters need to be provided in single quote. Alright, so let's say customer first name as Robert, and then comma, and then the customer last name as Deland, and then let's say his date of birth is 2013 2010 0101. Alright, so even the date you are providing it in the string, okay, as a string. So once you have that query ready, try to execute it against SQL Server e-training database. So click execute. You can see one row got affected. That means one record has been inserted. So now you know that the data has been inserted. So how do you view that data in the table? So if you right click on that particular table which you have inserted the data, right click on that and then select the top 1000 rows. You can see the data in the table. You can also view the command which is used to retrieve the data. We will see how to write this command. Okay, so whatever table you want to view the data, you can always right click on that and then select top 1000 rows option, and then you will be able to see the data. So that's one way of looking at the data. But if you want to view the data by writing a t-sql code, you have to use select command. So select is used to retrieve the data from a table. So how do you do that? So select star from table name. That's the syntax for simple select. Alright, so select star from, just provide the table name that we inserted the data, customer underscore SQL, and then try to run that particular query. Whenever you are trying to run these SQL queries, you want to make sure that you have to select that particular query which you want to execute it, because if you don't select it and then if you try to click execute button without selecting any query, all the queries in that particular query window will be executed. Alright, so you always want to make sure which query you want to run. So just select that particular query and then click execute button. Okay, so right now I want to just select star from that customer underscore SQL table and then click execute. You can see the data in the table that we inserted into that particular table, the customer ID, the customer first name, last name, and date of birth. So that is how you view your data. Now, how do you use insert statement to insert multiple records at the same time? So in our previous query, we have inserted only one particular row. So how do you write a query to insert multiple values? So all you have to do is, let's say we are inserting second record and then Chad and then his last name as Miles and then let's say 2009. So that's my second record. Alright, that's the first record for this insert statement. Okay, so that's my record one, and then I want to provide another set of row. So just copy that and then put it as second record. Alright, so for the second record you have to provide the details 103 and then let's say bill and then bill and then 2008. So now if I try to run this particular insert statement, you can see two records got affected, two rows got affected. So if you want to view the data, you can right click on the customer table and then select top 1000 rows, or if you want to view by t-sql code, you can run the same command, select star from customer SQL and then execute it. You can see 3 records got in the table. Alright, so that is how you insert the data into a table. And then now let's talk about what is null and what is not null. Alright. So null means nothing but if you know any information related to this column. Let's say here we have customer ID, customer first name, last name and date of birth. For example, here in this particular case, when we inserted all these three records, we know all the information. And in some cases, if you don't know some information, let's say if you don't know the date of birth of Bill, so what you have to enter in this particular field. Okay, so if you don't know any value, you can enter null. That means you can say you don't know the value or the value is unknown. Alright, so how do you do that? Let's try to insert another record. Let's try to insert another record. Let's say 104, and then let's say his first name is Tom, and then Hanks, and then let's say 2007. Okay, let's say we do not know any information for date of birth of Tom. Okay, so all I will have to provide is just provide null and then try to run your query, and then if you run your select query again, you can see null has been inserted into date of birth. That means you do not know the date of birth of Tom. Alright, so that's how the unknown information will be replaced by nulls. So when you are trying to create a table structure, you have provided the null properties for each column. Alright, so if you provide null, that means this column will allow nulls. That means you can provide nulls if it is unknown. Alright, so what if you provide not null? When you are trying to create the table structure, if you have provided not null, that means that particular column will not allow nulls. That means there should be some information in that particular column. You just cannot provide nulls. That means that column cannot be null. It's not a nullable column. Alright, so let's try to create another table. Let's say create table and then customer SQL 1. Alright, so let's say my customer ID is integer and then not null, or let's say null, and then my customer first name as varchar 50, and then it's a nullable column. That means first name may be null, customer last name as varchar 50, and then let's say you are allowing nulls, and then let's say SSL. Alright, so let's say varchar 10, and then you don't want to have nulls in that particular field. That means every customer needs to provide their SSL. Alright, so once you have that query ready, try to create or try to execute that against the database. It says command completed successfully. Make sure that table got created by refreshing the tables. You can see customer SQL 1 got created. Now if you look at the data in the table, select star from that particular table, there is no data as of now. So if you want to insert the data into the table, I'll just copy the command, same command, insert command. Now just change the table name, insert into the new table, and then customer ID, customer first name, customer last name, and then the last field is SSL. Now let's say the customer ID is 101 and then Tom Hanks, and then if you provide null in place of SSN and then try to execute the query, you get an error saying cannot insert the value null into column SSM table. This column does not allow nulls. Insert fails. That means you have to provide some value into the SSN field. Let's say 111 11 111. Okay, so now you can, okay, so the query, the error which it gives here is the string or binary data would be truncated. That means this column, SSN column, when we created this structure, we are providing only 10 characters, but then here we have given 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, more than 10 characters. Alright, so for that reason it gives you an error saying the data would be truncated. So let's check, let's just give 111-11. Okay, so and try to execute that particular query. You can see one record got inserted. Alright, so if you run that select statement again, you can see that particular record has been inserted. So SSN column will not allow any null fields. That means there should be some information in that particular field. It may be right or wrong, but there needs to be some kind of information. Okay, so if you want to insert second record, let's say 102, and then let's say David, and then David, and then for SSN you just provided 111 and 12. In the last name, in the first name and the customer ID will allow nulls. That means you may not need all that information. So for that reason I'll just provide null, null, and then null for the first three columns, and for the last column I'm not supposed to enter null because it will not allow any nulls. So if I try to run customer SQL, that insert statement, it says one record got inserted, and then if you run the select query, you can see the second record has been inserted with SSN value, but all other information is still null. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is, if you don't want to provide customer ID, first name and last name, all you want to provide is just SSN, what you will do is insert into that table and then just don't provide the column names for that columns which you don't want to insert the data. Okay, so I just want to insert SSN. So the all other columns will still be nulls. Alright, so it will just take the default value as null. So if you run that particular query, you can see one row affected, and then if you run the select query against the table, you can see the third record with 11113 SSN, and then the all other information is just null because you did not insert any values into those columns, it just inserted null. Okay, so by looking at that null, you can say the information is unknown. So these are the two ways which you can provide the information or provide nulls into those columns, nullable columns. Okay, so let's say if you just want to insert customer ID, customer first name and customer last name, and then if you try to ignore SSN, alright, so you don't want to give SSN, and then customer ID, let's say 103, and then the first name as William, and then let's say last name as null. Alright, so if you try to insert this particular data, that means the first name as 103, William null, and then the last name as also null, and then SSN you are just not providing in the column list, so by default it will take it as null because you did not provide anything, and then if you try to execute this query, it will still give you an error saying null cannot be inserted into SSN. If you do not provide any column in here, it will take the default value as null. So SSN has took null value while inserting into that table. But SSN will not allow any nulls. So it threw an error. So for that reason, you have to provide SSN column and then you have to provide some value in that SSN field. Alright. Now your insert statement executes perfectly. So for executing the query, just select the query and then try to click execute, or let's say Control E. Control E is the keyboard shortcut for executing your query against the database. So let's say Control E and then you can see the same result. One row got affected, and then run the select query against the table. You can see the fourth record got inserted with SSN value. So all the nullable columns, that means the columns which allow nulls, you can insert null values into those fields, or you can ignore those columns while inserting the data. But not null fields should have some information provided. Alright, so that's how you work with nulls and not nulls. Okay, so for example, if you are creating a Gmail application, so in that Gmail application, there's a web form where a customer, if he wants to sign up, a user, if he wants to sign up, he has to provide some details. Let's say first name, last name, date of birth, and then user ID and password and some address information. You can see asterisk marks provided on each particular field, saying all those fields which are marked with asterisk are mandatory. That means you have to provide information in that fields. So that's how you restrict user to provide important information. That means without first name or without last name or without user ID or without password, you cannot create a account, right? So when you provide that asterisk, that means that information is required to create a account, and that information will be entered into the table. Alright, so the table structure needs to be designed in such a way that the data in the table has some meaning towards it. For example, here in this case, we created customer SQL with customer ID, first name, last name and SSN, but then customer ID is null, first name is null, last name is null and SSN is not null. So if you look at the data in the table, now you allowed nulls in ID field, first name and last name. But if you look at the SSN, which doesn't make any sense, because looking at the SSN, you just cannot say whose information is that, what is his first name, what is his last name. Alright, so for that reason, when you are trying to create a table structure, you have to be very careful which columns you have to provide nulls and which columns you have to provide not nulls. Okay, so in this case, our table structure is wrong. So customer ID should be not null. That means every customer needs to have some ID. Alright, so for example, if we take a bank account, every customer in the bank needs to have some kind of ID. Let's say bank account ID or account number or some customer number, but he needs to have some particular ID. Alright, so similar way, every customer needs to provide his first name, and then every customer needs to have some last name. Alright, so the correct table structure, if you want to create for this particular scenario, you can say, let's say SQL 2, because you cannot create two tables with the same name. Alright, so customer ID and then not null, and then the first name is also not null, and then the last name is also not null, and let's say SSN also not null, because every customer needs to provide SSN. Let's say, let's take another field called customer nickname. Alright, and then let's say varchar 50. So this particular column or field it's not mandatory for every person, because some customers may choose it or some customers may leave it. So for that particular reason, we can provide nulls. That means this particular column is not so important, so I'm providing null. So that's how you design a table. Alright. So in this video, we have looked at how to create a table and what are nulls and what are not nulls. And then we also looked at insert command. How do we insert the data into a table in various ways. Alright. So in my next upcoming videos, we will talk in more details about the update and delete and select commands. Alright. Thank you all for attending this video.